intentionally, but my system keeps crashing, so I'll come back if I do. So yeah, and I went to school in Scotland and grew up in Scotland, lived in Scotland till I was in my early 20s. And we always have a view, I think, that the Scottish education system is superior. I don't mean now that a better job is being done in Scotland than in the rest of the UK. In fact, I think the SNP are letting down Scottish school children pretty badly. If you look at things like the educational attainment of Scottish children in international comparative tables. But what I do mean is the sort of philosophy of education in Scotland, which is much more broad for longer. You know, we don't specialise in 3 A-level subjects post 16. University undergraduate degrees are longer, 4-year undergraduate degrees typically. So that certainly was my experience. And I guess on the other side, certainly when I was at school, and that is a very long time ago, Fiona, there was a real emphasis on teaching Scottish history, Scottish literature, Scottish culture, Scottish identity. And there are pluses and minuses to that. I think it did create a bit of insularity, to be honest. But it's something that I've heard other Scots say later on didn't happen, that they felt that it was kind of airbrushed out of their education. And I think that's interesting when I think about identity issues and their place in our education system in England today.
I mean, presumably at that stage in Scotland, you were in a comprehensive school. Yeah,
absolutely. Scotland had gone pretty well entirely comprehensive while I was still in primary school, I think. So yeah, I was in a 6-year comprehensive just outside Edinburgh.
Well, that's good, because there aren't enough people in frontline politics yet who went to comprehensive schools.
Well, I'm not. But I mean, my view is, having spent 6 years in one as a pupil, that you get a very good education in a good comprehensive, and it certainly hasn't held me back. It was tremendous in the quality of teaching, the variety of things you could study. And I'm, as you know, Fiona, I am absolutely passionately pro-comprehensive education, and I would have it for every child.
Okay, I'm sure we're going to come back to that later. But I mean, how do you think this shaped you in your politics? I mean, do you feel you have an education philosophy? And if so, what is it that really fires you up?
I would say two things, really, two very different factors, perhaps. First of all, I come from a family of teachers. So both my parents were teachers. My dad in particular, a very, very dedicated career teacher who was variously a primary and secondary teacher, a head teacher, and lectured in teacher training around what we would now call school leadership. In those days, they called it educational management. He loved teaching, absolutely loved being in the classroom. If you took him into a school, you couldn't keep him away from the chalk face. And for both my parents, education had been a real route out of the poverty, the really deep poverty that they had known growing up in Scotland in the 1930s. Both families were very, very poor. Often my grandfathers, both of them, would be out of work. They'd go down to the Glasgow shipyards on a Monday morning to look for work. Sometimes there'd be jobs. Sometimes there wouldn't. We call that a 0 hours contract today, not a new phenomenon. Shocking, we are still like that today. Sometimes they'd go home and say to my grandmothers, there's no money this week. And education for my parents, because quite unusually for someone of my age, I'm not the first in my family to go to university. That was my father. Education for my parents was absolutely the route out of poverty. It was the route to security, to being able to provide for yourself and your family. And so that really is a very deep-rooted underlying principle for me about why I believe so passionately in good, high-quality education as the foundation, the bedrock of security and opportunity and chances in life. And it links to the other reason that I feel really passionate about this. As you said in your introduction, Fiona, before I was in Parliament, I was Chief Executive of the Child Poverty Action Group, campaigning for a socially just, equal society in which nobody grows up poor has been, the last 20 years of my life. And I see a huge crossover between the education brief and what we want to achieve as a party to eliminate child poverty. With the best education system in the world, teachers would still be working with one hand tied behind their back if we don't address child poverty. There is only so much schools can do to compensate for poverty and disadvantage. And so when I was asked by Keir to take on this role last summer, he at the same time asked me to bring my old job as Shadow Minister for Child Poverty Strategy with me. And I'm really delighted that Keir has seen the power of putting the briefs together. And so that, I would say that is a really important part of what we're trying to achieve in the team.
Excellent. Now, can I take you away from Scotland for a minute and bring you down to England, where the overriding philosophy, or I would call it an ideology in schools policy over the last 30 years, has been that of the market, that parent choice, diversity, competition, and obviously we've seen that being extended to higher education in recent years as well. Do you think it's worked?
No, not really. And in fact, I think the COVID crisis has kind of brought into very sharp relief the deficiencies of a market approach, deficiencies we were aware of anyway, deficiencies we would want to address on a return to government. But I think they have been really shown up for their insufficiency in the course of this COVID crisis. So universities being a good example first. I mean, the market model now, where students can't obviously have their usual university experience, they can't be on campus, they've been told to stay at home. It's hardly surprising that they're asking for their money back, that they see their university education in contractual, transactional terms. And universities, of course, are saying, well, that's extremely difficult because we are funded on the basis of a market model, students buying our tuition, our teaching. And you know, we're now in very great danger of seeing a higher education system where that tension between the customer and the supplier and the fact that it's entirely driven by market forces puts our whole higher education sector in a very vulnerable and difficult place. Some universities, I say the whole sector, some universities much more than others. Some are obviously very rich, have reserves, foundations and all the rest. But they're a real concern for the sector overall that the market model is going to really be exposed as creating great fragility as we find ourselves in this crisis. And then in schools too, I think it's not so much that you would say it's that's about follow the money, although there is an element of that, as the fragmentation and competition between schools, between the academies and the maintained school, the local authority maintained schools, between you know, a very, very, you might say, results-focused accountability system, which drives competition between schools and actually leads schools to feel under pressure to make certain decisions about admissions or about exclusions. I think in the course of marketizing, if you like, our education system, what has been lost is what should have been central, which is children's best interests and well-being. And a real sense that although many parents are extremely happy with their child's school and the education their child is getting, overall we've got a fragmented system that, by being broken up in this way, it really hasn't shown itself as well placed to withstand the forces that are affecting it now. And again, you would see that in the early years, Fiona. You know, 20,000 nursery providers could be out of business within the next 6 months because of the funding regime and the dependence on you know, demand side funding, really. So I think all these questions would have been in our minds anyway, but they have really been brought centre stage by the pressures of the COVID crisis.
Well, can I pin you down a bit though on what elements of the market you'd like to see changed? I mean, you referred in your introduction to comprehensive education. I mean, there's a very strong view in the Labour Party, I think, that the grammar schools have no place in a Labour education system, or what education that's fair for all. And you could apply that principle as well to some faith schools, and certainly to some of the principles behind academies. So there are some quite thorny issues there for Labour to wrestle with. I mean, which bits of it would you try and unpick?
Well, I think you've got to start actually by worrying about what's going on in schools and what's coming out of them, what experience children are having and what they're achieving, whether they're enjoying an enriching, fulfilling, enjoyable education and coming out in a position where they've been enabled to make the most of their potential and to move forward in the best way that they want to in life. So I would have to say, and I know this disappoints Labour members up and down the country when I do say it, structures are not my top priority going into government. Structures that get in the way of those goals, obviously we need to be looking at how we can address them. But the most important thing to us is what's happening inside schools and how we can help schools to work together in families of schools and schools partnerships to support one another to bring about the very best education for all of our kids. Now that might involve some fiddling around with structures, it might involve some fairly wholesale restructuring in time, but it's not my starting point. My starting point is how can we get the very best education in schools for children? And we know some of the components of that are things like the quality of teaching that they receive and how you attract and retain really skilled, highly qualified, highly professional teachers. We know that resources are really important, and having the allocation of funding to address the needs of the pupils in that school and to take account of disadvantage and to enable students from the most disadvantaged backgrounds to have all the resources around them to address not just their educational but their socio-economic needs. We know that rooting schools in their community is really important. So democratic local accountability is important, and we have to find ways to put that back in place. I know many people would say, if you look at the big multi-academy chains, that they've got no real local connection with communities at all. So I think the elements of the market that we are worried about would be about unequal distribution of resources, would be about lack of local accountability and engagement, would be about competition for keeping teachers, excellent teachers in the classroom, would be about things like admissions and exclusions policy. It may be that necessitates some structural change. It probably does, but our starting point is really to get under the skin of what needs to happen in school and concentrate on that.
I mean, I can see questions coming in on all those things. So I'm going to move on a bit now, because I'm sure some of these issues will come back up in the questions. I mean, the last century in education has been marked out by relatively few really memorable moments. Probably the 1944 Act, Baker Act, which brought in the national curriculum of parent choice, the education, Tony Blair's Labour years, the investment, the sort of prescription at the beginning of the academies, and then I regret to say Gove's reforms post-2010. Whatever you may think of them, they certainly were a seismic change. But since then, Labour has kind of struggled to define itself against the Tory agenda, and I wondered why you thought that was.
Yeah, isn't that an interesting question? Why have we struggled? I suppose because, first of all, perhaps because we think education is ours, that we think we own it, and that we haven't realised that we have to fight for what we believe in. Similarly, perhaps to health, we've always assumed that the NHS is a Labour creature, and of course people will trust us with the NHS, and that we have popular support on our side. And I guess maybe we felt the same about education and assumed that people would understand where we were coming from and would share the views that we have. I suppose I would say we have to recognise that parents care about things like high standards, about attainment, about behaviour, and perhaps for a time we've been uncomfortable with some of those drivers of education policy. Not, I think, under Tony Blair. I think he was very bold on those sorts of territories, but perhaps in more recent years there's been a nervousness for Labour, completely misplaced in my view. If we want the very best for all of our children, and especially for the children for whom education can make the most difference, then those are things we shouldn't compromise on. But perhaps we've found some of that uncomfortable in certain periods in Labour's education experience. And then I suppose if you just look at where voters are in education, it's in the last decade or so, it's never really been one of their top issues. So, which is almost a surprise to me, actually. Top issues are things like the NHS or the economy and jobs, or from perhaps not so much now, but certainly 3 or 4 years ago, immigration. Those sorts of issues bubble up more in the public consciousness. So perhaps we're going to have to work harder to cut through to say to the public, this really matters. This is central to the kind of country we want to be, the best country to grow up in, as Keir says, and the kind of way in which we are going to protect the influence and strength of our country in the world.
Okay. In The Guardian recently, one of your education team, Wes Streeting, described the National Education Service as a slogan. Do you agree with that? And a lot of people will be wondering what its status is now. I mean, is the idea of free universal education through to graduation, i.e. no tuition fees, still a thing? And is this still the aim of the Labour Party? And just to follow up from that, I think a lot of people who are listening to this will want to know what the process is for developing Labour Party education policy, since that was the last thing anybody heard about the National Education Service. What is going to happen next, and what's people's involvement in that going to be, and when do you think we'll get some sort of firm ideas that the public and supporters can cling on to?
I mean, I would quite like to know how we're going to be developing policy in the Labour Party too, and colleagues will know that there is a review of the national policy making process underway now, and you know, education won't be different. We will be part of that national process. I'd also say that we are, you know, 3, perhaps 4 years away from a general election. We don't want to be making detailed policy too early for a number of reasons. One, we're in the middle of a COVID crisis. We have to address what's going on right in front of our noses. That's too urgent and too acute to put to one side. And any decisions you might make in the context of a crisis could be really outmoded and inappropriate once we come through the pandemic and see what kind of world we move on into in the future. So you want a flexibility in policy that enables you to respond to the kind of world that we are going to become. And of course, you know from long experience, Fiona, as do I, that if Labour puts up a whole policy programme early in a parliament, it simply gives the Conservatives longer to shoot it down, to say it's too expensive, to say it won't work, to say that it's about class warfare, to criticise it on any grounds that they can and allow their narrative to challenge our policy programme, or if they like any of the ideas, to just nick them and do them themselves. So we're not at the point in the policy cycle where we're making detailed policies. On the National Education Service, I mean, Wes was half quoted in that article. You didn't write it, did you? Wasn't it in your article? No, I'm just checking before I'm going to say the journalist treated him a little harshly. So what Wes was trying to say was people didn't understand what it meant, that we had got over the brand, if you like. People had heard National Education Service, but people didn't know what it meant. And you've characterised what we did mean by it quite rightly as being about a commitment to lifelong access to education, and you know, lifelong learning is a huge animating principle for Labour, and was in the last Parliament with our Lifelong Learning Commission, and continues to be for us now. And I am pretty confident that the policy making process, whatever it is, will fill out the detail of that to be central to our manifesto in 2023 or 24. So yes, universal access. You know, I have a big interest in what we can do around the early years. I really want us to reposition and reassert the centrality of the early years as the building block of and really the most important part of our education system. You know, the investment you make in the early years pays the greatest dividends. We've got to embed it into our whole education system in such a way that we can't have the Tories do again what they did in 2010, which is unscramble the work that we had done to build up Sure Start. So embedding early years right into the integrated lifelong learning education service, national education service, if you like, that we want to see. And you asked about at the other end, access to adult learning, higher education and further education. And both are really, really important to us. Keir in his leadership campaign did commit again to free tuition. I'm particularly concerned about maintenance costs for higher education students. We're seeing, again, talking about the COVID crisis, you know, the real problem that those are causing now as students are demanding, you know, money back for rent on accommodation they're not actually able to live in. And our huge emphasis on further and adult education, which has been the poor relation of education policy in the last 10 years, massively underfunded by the Conservatives. Late in the day, they're now having a sort of road to Damascus conversion about it, at least they say they are. But the investment that we need to make in lifelong learning and skills and retraining for adults, particularly in a very, very unpredictable labour market, is central to our priorities. And that means second chances, it means third chances, it means being able to come in again and re-qualify at the same level, but in a completely different skill because the labour market will have changed. And it means making sure that that access to education is easy and non-stigmatizing. And so those are real priorities for us. When we talk about a national education service, okay, perhaps what we really want to talk about is a lifelong journey through education. I think that's what's really animating us, that at every stage of your life, your education is your right.
Thank you. Well, I think we have to come back to the elephant in the room now, which is the pandemic and the impact that's having on the education system, forcing us right into the present day. I mean, the government response has been absolutely woeful. Why do you think Gavin Williamson is still in office?
I have no idea why anybody thinks it's a good idea to entrust our children's education to Gavin Williamson. He has failed them again and again, failed them on remote learning, failed them on school meals, failed them on exams, failed them on whether or not schools are going to be open to all children, or if they're going to reopen after the Christmas holidays. And he doesn't just fail once on each of these things, he fails again and again. So we had promises of laptops in June, not met. Here we are in January, promises of laptops not met again. We were told in the summer that they wouldn't provide free school meals over the summer holidays. We were told that again over October half term. Here we are just last week seeing meagre food parcels being handed around, and they're not going to do free school meals in the February half term. Look at exams, huge chaos, an utter debacle, shambles last August. Really heartbreaking, terrible, anxious time for our young people. And here we are in January, and he's just beginning to consult on what he might do this summer in case, well, as exams won't now be going ahead. We told him way back in September he would need a plan B in case exams couldn't take place in 2021. He hasn't even got a plan A, and now he's looking for a plan C. He doesn't just make mistakes, Fiona, he makes the same mistakes repeatedly. And I really don't understand now why anybody can think it's a good idea to keep him in the job.
You could argue that the job of the opposition is to take a few scalps. Do you think you'll get his?
Well, I hope so, because our children need him to go.
Okay. So in terms of the pandemic, I mean, I know you say that it's not a very good time to be making policy, and I can see pros and cons for that point of view, but what lessons would you draw from the pandemic, and how do you think that this might influence the development of Labour policy?
Yeah, so we think about this a lot, and I think there are quite a lot of examples. Let's pick one or two. So I think exams are a really good case in point, and assessment generally. So what we got with the Gove, you called them reforms, Fiona. I don't call them reforms because reform sort of implies improvement. And I don't think much of what Gove did improved our education system. But the Gove changes mean that we now, for secondary children, throw everything into a terminal exam at 16 and then at 18. Along comes a pandemic, you can't hold those terminal exams, you've got nothing to fall back on. Wales still has AS levels, but we've lost all coursework, all assessment through the period that students are studying in the run up to those final exams. And one lesson from the pandemic, a lesson I think we would have in Labour wanted to pick up and look at anyway, but really brought into stark relief in the pandemic. Don't put all your eggs in one basket. Don't put them all in the basket of one single terminal exam. I think there's some really interesting stuff coming out around remote learning. So, okay, we're seeing children learning at home because they have to, they cannot be in school. But as with the world of work, I suspect that we are going to find ourselves moving into more blended models of learning in the future. And the role of what happens at home and home learning is going to become more important in the future in supplement to what is going on in the classroom. And I think we've learned again what we should have known, that children from the most disadvantaged, the most impoverished backgrounds are significantly more disadvantaged if they're having to undertake some of their learning at home. They won't have the digital access. Mind you, I'm right up there with them at the moment. I'm struggling with my digital access too. But they won't have the digital access. They may not have the right conditions to be studying at home, overcrowding. Perhaps the house isn't well heated, or perhaps it's damp, perhaps it's cold. Are they getting nourishing food? Are they going to be able to eat healthily while studying at home, and so on? So socioeconomic circumstances, I think if we're going to see more, a greater role for home learning in education in future, and I think we will, we need to also realise that means that the disproportionate disadvantage of those in straightened home circumstances will become even more of an issue. To some degrees, going to school can compensate for that, not entirely. As we know, the attainment gap continues to widen as children progress through school. But, you know, I think there's something we really have to learn about addressing underlying poverty and inequality. And not just about making sure every kid has got a laptop and access to mobile data, vital though that is. There's going to be a real need to focus on that socioeconomic inequality as part of what I think will become a new way of our living our lives. I think we've learned a lot about the importance of teachers and school staff. And I think a lot of parents have come to respect the professionalism of teachers as they've struggled with home teaching for themselves. And I think that's maybe one of the good things to have come out of this situation, that there is an opportunity really to reinforce what people can now see absolutely right in front of them, that we are very, very fortunate to have highly committed professional teaching staff, school leaders and school support staff. They've done a tremendous job, and I think there's a real lesson for us about investing in the workforce, how central they have been in the last 10 months to children's learning and to their well-being. And I think that's a real opportunity for us to reassert the status of the teaching profession, something that I think has been absolutely undermined in recent years.
Well, that's definitely true. I think I'm going to take from that a hint that Labour would consider getting rid of terminal exams.
Not entirely. I think there is a place for exams in the assessment process.
Not getting rid of them altogether, but just saying putting everything in the basket.
That would certainly be my view, that it's unwise, and it's not a reflection of real life, let's face it. You don't just get one chance at anything else in life. Why are we giving our kids at 16 or 18, and 16 in particular, of course, there's a very live debate about is that the right age anyway, but putting that debate to one side for a moment, I think there's a real question about, surely we want a richer way of capturing a young person's achievement than simply saying, we'll throw it all in how well you do in one set of exams and in a matter of a few hours on a day in May or June.
Okay. Now I've got a few more minutes before we're going to open it up to questions. I wanted to ask you one other incredibly important question, especially in the light of Brexit and the need for us to develop our own skills rather than have to import them, which is obviously not going to be as easy to do in the next decade as it was in the last. So the English secondary school curriculum is still very academically focused, and vocational qualifications, whatever way you cut it, are seen as second-class citizens compared to A-level. And the pinnacle of the English education system is still a degree in classics from Oxford, like the one that's held by the Prime Minister. What sort of changes do you think would need to be made to finally move away from this terrible divide that's bedeviled the English education system for the last 70 or 80 years?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think there are quick fixes to this, but I think it is absolutely important that this is given priority. And the government are saying this. It will be interesting to see if they publish their white paper this coming week, as there are rumours they may, whether they're able to put their money where their mouth is. I very much doubt it, particularly as we know we're only looking at a one-year funding settlement after 10 years of huge underfunding of the FE sector. I'm quite sceptical that we're going to see the investment in adult and further education that we need. So the first part of the answer to your question, Fiona, is resources, isn't it? It's, you know, that underfunded sector needs to have the investment in it to deliver the top quality learning and skills that enable us to say to prospective students, the quality of what you will experience will be exceptional. It will be top quality. And part of that, of course, is making sure that those who teach you are paid a decent salary for doing so. And, you know, FE lecturers earn what, 5,000 or 6,000 less than teachers typically? There can be no case for that if we seriously want to value and invest in further and adult education. I think there is an issue about working with employers. I think that is really important. I don't think that works well dictated by national policy. Where I'm an MP in Greater Manchester, I think we see a real opportunity with our Metro Mayor, Andy Burnham, to bring together on that footprint, on your regional footprint, your industrial strategy, your local economic strategies, if you like, and employers and business, with your education and skills strategy and other strategies, you know, your health and well-being strategy. So I think there's a real opportunity for devolved powers in this area to align the way in which we invest in skills and training with the economic ambitions and strategies in a particular region or area. And that is something that the present government has absolutely set its face against. And when we asked Gavin Williamson about it before Christmas, he said no, he had no interest in devolving the skills budget. He didn't intend to do it. He didn't intend to give that autonomy away to mayors and local government. And I think that is a seriously bad mistake if we're to make the most of the opportunities of developing skills. I think we've got to have lifelong pathways. We were talking about this a moment ago, into further study, into skills and training and retraining. And that means that, you know, I'm not saying this is Labour policy and it has a bit of a checkered history, but there are things like individual learning accounts that you can look at that enable people to make choices and return to education and re-qualify as the labour market needs change around them and they want to reskill. And I think we need to make that as possible and as free of barriers as we can for people. And I think then the most difficult bit, you hope it would be the consequence of initiatives like that. But if people have got other suggestions for ways we can do this, I'm really up for hearing them. We need to find a way of giving status to these technical and vocational qualifications. You can see the government trying to do that a bit with T-levels. The jury's out on those. But you can see it with degree apprenticeships, which I think are highly thought of. But I think this issue of how do we recognise and give status to these qualifications? Obviously, what goes into them is a very important part of that. But I am very interested in hearing, particularly if there are any employers on this call, what people think we could do, really to talk about the quality of what people are learning, the quality of the skills they are acquiring, and the expertise that they are able to offer when they've completed adult or further learning.
Mm. Yeah, well, it's a very interesting comments. Unfortunately, you can't see them, but somebody has mentioned the Tomlinson report, and one comment
lost
is about not, don't always reinvent the wheel. I mean, some of the things that were done in the past would bear looking at again. I can think of several examples. David Blunkett did quite a good report into how academies and local maintained schools could work together, etc. Anyway, I just want to wind up by asking you a couple of things. Which of Labour's achievements in office would you say you were most proud?
Taking 1.1 million children out of poverty between 1997 and 2010. That was phenomenal. You know, the best performance of any developed economy, and not by accident, but by deliberate policy choices. We transformed children's lives, ensuring their parents had enough money, improved so many socio-emotional and outcomes and opportunities for children and young people. I'm immensely proud of our track record on child poverty. Sure Start, a huge, visionary, ambitious achievement, again, made a difference to a generation of children, and more than children, their families and communities too. And I talk a lot about mums in my constituency who their children are in their late teens and 20s, going off to university themselves. But those mums all know each other because they got together when the kids were very young at the local Sure Start. And as a result, those mums to this day are the backbone of the community in my constituency. When the pandemic came along and, all over the country, people were trying to set up these mutual aid organisations, it was the mums that knew one another from Sure Start that knew how to get together and make things happen. Sure Start was a really incredible investment, something I'm immensely proud of. And our biggest mistake with Sure Start was that we didn't make it impossible for the Tories to dismantle. We are not going to make that mistake again.
Okay. And finally, what would you like to be remembered for?
I would like to be, if I'm lucky enough to be the Secretary of State for Education, I would like to be part of the effort to rebuild that early years offer in a way that makes it something that parents absolutely take for granted, will be there, and they will use it in the same ways they do the primary school and the secondary school. That would be an achievement that I would like Labour in office, and if I get the chance, myself as Education Secretary, to be able to deliver to the next generation of kids.
Thank you very much. I'm sorry we can't all give you a big round of applause, but I am going to do that personally. And also, if I can get the tech right, I think we have a number of questions waiting. Is that right? Susanna? No? Clap. Susanna, do we have a question from Susanna? Okay, until I hear from Susanna, I'm going to start asking some of the questions I can see in the question box. The arts in education, particularly music, this is from Anonymous, has been underfunded and undervalued by the present government. How will Labour address this? I'll take them in threes.
Just write them down, Fiona, off we get.
Okay. So arts and education. James Stewart, lifelong pathways. How can we apply this ambition across Labour policy? Okay, I think some of these are repeating each other a bit. James, regional devolved strategies and skills. No, that I can't see the end of that question. Sorry. Adam Parr, with recent focus on STEM and an economic approach to education, will Labour make the arts and humanities as seen as important as STEM, as we have seen a lack of the key broad and soft skills that arts and humanities teach? So there's two questions about arts in education and soft skills and creativity while I master these questions.
Okay, shall I take those two, and also the one on lifelong pathways that James asked? So the arts and humanities, this is really important to me, and it is one of the things that I think has been diminished by some of the Gove changes, squeezed out. The time has been squeezed for them in the curriculum, and that is to my huge regret. Partly for purely selfish reasons. The arts have given me immense pleasure throughout my life, and I want other children and young people to have the opportunity to enjoy them in the way that I have always been able to. But they're important educationally as well. You know, they're important for children's emotional and social development. Particularly, we're seeing that right now in the course of the pandemic. They actually, children undertaking arts and cultural activities will attain in other subjects too. They fit together well. They enrich lives, obviously. It's really important to recognise that among our children and young people, we will have some who can be world-class performers, artists, creators. We should ensure that the curriculum that we offer them in school brings out and enables them to reach their full potential. You know, we will have people who can deliver to the world. It's also, I think, really important to recognise the role of the arts in giving children and young people a sense of belonging, being part of the school community, that their identity is recognised and celebrated. If you think about the Black Curriculum campaign or LGBT or Disability History Month, for example, giving young people the opportunity to see their own identity reflected through arts and culture gives them a sense of confidence and self-esteem, which is so essential to successful learning. In fact, I think, though, you're not just talking about doing that in the arts. You should be mainstreaming that through all subjects. You know, what writers are you reading? What musicians are you listening to? What playwrights are you looking at? Which painters, but also, you know, which mathematicians, which scientists, which political thinkers. It's very important to me that we have an inclusive education system in which every young person's identity is recognised and celebrated. And I think that the absolutely right and sensible and understandable emphasis on the STEM subjects and the need to drive up our performance as a country in STEM and attract more young people, particularly girls, to study the STEM subjects is absolutely the right one, but needs to be equally matched by what I think researchers at LSE are calling SHAPE. I'm afraid I can't remember all of what SHAPE stands for, but H is humanities and A is arts, I think. Somebody may know what all of SHAPE is and helpfully put it in the chat box and we can see it. I think, you know, they should be equal partners in our education system. It shouldn't be one or the other. We should be absolutely proud to invest in and bring out children's potential in both. This is something I'm actually in very active discussion about with colleagues in the world of arts education. So just a couple of days ago, I was actually in an extremely useful meeting with the Cultural Learning Alliance, who have a lot of ideas about what we should be doing in this area. And it's something that I'm very keen to work on. And James's question about lifelong pathways, this is what I was beginning to talk about, Fiona, a bit when we were chatting a few moments ago, that we don't want to shut doors. We want people to be able to go back into education, to redirect themselves, to make different choices, second and third chances all the way through life. But we do need to recognise that if we don't have pipelines, if we don't have building blocks in place, people can't just jump in. And that's why there's a particular problem at the moment, for example, that, you know, in the government's FE proposals, they're offering guarantees that people will be able to get new level 2 or level 3 qualifications. But if they're not putting in the investment for people to get the basic skills to enable them to get into the pipeline towards those qualifications, then, you know, these are meaningless commitments for some people. And so I think it's really important to think of people's pathways into and out of different opportunities for study, and the ability to build on what's been studied before, redirect and learn new things when and if they want to. But Joe Sims has helpfully told us what shape is. That's very good. It really is important that we do think about lifelong pathways as well as lifelong entitlement to learning. And we also have to think about, you know, how that is funded in a way that students can afford to participate.
Okay, I'm going to have to paraphrase some of these questions because there are an awful lot going back to 3 o'clock. First one is, what are Labour's plans for re-establishing Sure Start centres? I'll take them in 3. There are quite a few questions about your commitment to moving to comprehensive education, but how would we get there? What would you do about the grammar schools in your constituency? And also, where do faith schools fit into this model of inclusive comprehensive education?
So, okay, on Sure Start first. I think if you look at our childcare and early years funding, it is a total mess. It's largely demand-led rather than supply-led. That makes it, I think, inherently more unstable. And I think it's incredibly confusing for parents. And it's not always particularly well directed. So that I think we've got to look at whether it's really achieving the goals that we should have for it, of enabling every child, including and especially those who are most disadvantaged, from having an excellent early years, early education experience, which feeds in as an integral part of then their move into reception and into the primary years. And so I think we need to start by sorting out the funding. At the same time as we have that clear educational vision for where our Sure Start sits. It's not just childcare. It's got a role in the wider community, as I said, really was important in the way that it enabled and empowered mums in my constituency, but that we really see it as part of the education and child development programme that we have for very young children, feeding into the next stage of their learning. And we know a lot from Sure Start, from the time when we were in power, about what works, what we need to do well, that it's important that the community feels ownership of it, that it's important, though, that we have very high standards and expectations of it, and it's important that we have a well-qualified, well-trained, well-paid professional workforce in the early years, and that needs to be a key component of what we do too. The comprehensive faith and selective education system, as one of the questioners has noted, in Trafford, I represent a constituency where we have selection at age 11. Actually, at age 10, the kids take the exams when they're 10 years old. These are little kids being put through what is actually a very stressful experience. It's not a fair experience. There are parents who can afford and do pay for extensive tutoring. And it's not a well-managed system, even in its own terms. Some children have to sit 2 or 3 or 4 different entrance exams because not all the grammar schools in Trafford work to the same test. I have said, since I very first became the Stretford and Urmston Labour candidate over 10 years ago, that I didn't agree with selection. All the evidence I had looked at, and I've looked at a lot, demonstrated clearly to me that it doesn't drive up standards, that for disadvantaged children, children on free school meals, children with special educational needs and disabilities, they are particularly unlikely to secure places in our grammar schools. I've gone around saying this in Stretford and Urmston since 2010, and I don't really believe it's lost me more than a handful of votes. So I do think we can afford to be brave about this policy, but what we absolutely don't want to be doing, where schools are doing a really good job, whatever structure or organisational model they fall into, I don't want to be making changes in structures and admissions policies that damage the quality of education that children are receiving. We've got to be driving up to the standards of the best. And in some of our grammar schools, the standards of teaching and learning and student support are very, very high indeed. Now, you might say it's easier for them because of the nature of the intake, but I don't see this as, I think we will have failed if in trying to get selection out of our system, we actually can't maintain the very highest standards for every kid. And so I think that's a real test for Labour, a really tough test for Labour. And I'd also say that although the majority of people in this country don't favour selective education, if you look at the polling, a majority of the country are not in favour of the grammar school system. It's a political challenge to do it, and we will have to proceed with care politically and ensure that we are engaging with parents, with communities about where they want to be in this and how we can reassure people that the best education will be on offer for every child. And faith schools similarly. Now, I recognise that for some parents, this is a choice based on their faith. It's important to the kind of ethos that they want their child to learn within. But too often, of course, that's not what's going on in faith schools. We do see that parents are finding ways into certain faith schools by choosing where to live and how to behave that might not actually reflect a particularly strong faith ethos in the home, but they're driven by educational motivations for their kids. Very understandable in parents that that's what drives them, but it's not fair to kids overall. I think if you look at the performance of different faith schools, and I have to say of different faiths, some are much, much more inclusive of children who are not of that faith background than others. I think there's got to be a real question about why some can do this well and others apparently refuse. And if faith schools are to remain a part of our schools landscape, then what can we do to ensure that that doesn't foster sectarianism or divides? And I come from Scotland where, sectarianism in education was a real thing in the 1960s and 70s. Thankfully, I think much less so in Scotland now. But you see new forms of division opening up today. And I think that if we are to see faith education having a place in our faith schools having a place in our education system, we also have to work very, very hard to make sure that there is much integrated learning and activity between and among schools of different faiths and non-denominational schools, so that children are not able to become isolated or unable to appreciate and understand that they live in a multicultural, multi-faith, highly diverse country where we have respect for everyone's faiths and beliefs.
Okay, I'm going to have another little group of three here. There are a couple of questions, one from Anna Smith, I think, and probably an anonymous, about Labour listening to teachers. And do you regret not listening to teachers who told you that schools should be closed before Christmas because of the pandemic? That's one of them. The second one from Perry Hewitt. I think this is really important. Perry's autistic, raised by a single parent, went to university, struggled all the way through, and he feels that autistic children are left behind in the education system when it comes to access to employment. They feel lost in the jungle of office politics and favouritism. I think you could probably apply that to a lot of young people with special educational needs and disabilities. So, and SEND often gets left out of, high-level policy making, in my experience. And then I've got a question from Liz Hind, who's an employer. Hang on. Well, I'll leave you to ask those and I'll find Liz's question. Oh, yeah, Liz. She's an employer with an education background, including being an NVQ assessor. The question for me is access to vocational courses that are short and fill a need that then get adults back and learning, much like the union learning provides a bridge back to adults that they've been away from education. There are quite a lot of questions about that, about lifelong learning and what Labour would do, and also about whether we actually still need examinations at 16 if all young people are going to have to stay on in education until they're 18. So that's quite a mouthful, but I'll try and fill it with all the others while you're answering them.
Okay, start with them, goodness. I'm asked again and again why I don't listen to teachers. Honestly, I spend, quite rightly, as you would expect me to, almost all of my time listening to teachers, meeting teachers, hearing from teachers and parents and students. And if we're going to talk particularly about the schools reopening in the new year, over Christmas and the new year, I spent the whole of the New Year weekend in really good, constructive, open conversations with all of the teaching unions and the unions representing school support staff. I really value those conversations with the unions. I think in relation to the particular decision about what needed to happen in school at the beginning of January, let's remember, first of all, the questioner says, listening to teachers saying school should shut before Christmas. In fact, neither the teaching unions nor we saw the SAGE advice about schools needing to close until just before New Year. The SAGE meeting took place on the 22nd of December that made that recommendation. The minutes were not published until the very end of the year. Closing schools, telling children not to go into school, I think it was the biggest punch in the stomach for me in March when the schools were closed. I suddenly became aware of the horrific impact that this would have on a generation of children. And children in my own constituency were crying that day. It's the last decision you would ever want to make, to say that children should not go into school. School is the best place for kids learning, for their socio-emotional development, for their well-being, for their safety in some cases. And nobody should expect that we would ever take a view on whether or not schools should close lightly or unduly swiftly. We wanted to take the scientific evidence. We listened to scientists over that New Year weekend. We met them. As I say, we talked to unions. We examined what the government was putting in place to support children's learning at home, and we found it wanting, to be honest. We looked very carefully at what the risk was in school to students, but also to teachers and to school staff. In the end, it was inevitable. We recognised it was inevitable that schools would have to close to most students at the beginning of January. But my whole focus now, and I hope we can work with unions and teaching professionals on this, is how do we get kids safely back into school with school staff and teachers as quickly as we can, because the damage that is done to children's long-term well-being and their short-term safety and education of not being in school is huge. The best place for them to be is in the classroom. Very interested in the question about children with autism and the wider SEND agenda, Fiona, that you raised. It's been said by, I think it's the National Audit Office, that the promises made by the government in 2014 for SEND children simply can't be achieved. The resources have not been put there. So parents and young people have been lied to, really, about what is going to be on offer for them. They've been given a set of expectations and rights that will not be fulfilled. And that is a disgrace. And in fact, not only will those expectations not be fulfilled, but as I was saying at the start of our discussion, the competition between schools, the accountability regime actually drives schools' admissions policies away from welcoming children with special educational needs and disabilities onto the school roll. It cannot be beyond our wit to design an accountability and measurement system that actually incentivizes schools to welcome those kids and give them the very best education. And it's absolutely right that, of course, that exclusion and disadvantage continues on into further and higher education and into employment too. And this government, Tory governments going back to 2010, have repeatedly stripped away the resources that were in place for disabled students allowances and so on, to enable adult learners and those in higher education to make the most of their education. And it's something that I think we need to give really, really serious attention when we come back into government. No child should have anything less than the best education. Every child should have the opportunity to make the most of their potential. And that is as much the case for a child with special needs or disabilities as it is for any child. And then questions about lifelong learning. I'm so pleased actually to see we've got so many questions and so much interest about this, Fiona, because it has been the poor relation of education policy for a very long time. But in fact, something Labour cares deeply about. And in the last Parliament, and in the run-up to the 2019 general election, we did a very big piece of work on it. Some people on the call may be familiar with Labour's Lifelong Learning Commission and the report that was produced, which set out a range of policies for lifelong learning, and some of which I've alluded to in the course of our discussion this afternoon about building blocks and the opportunity to come back into learning, about pipelines, about the way in which you might fund adult learning entitlements. But the most important thing is that we take this really seriously, that we do make it central to our education priorities and education policy. I don't think we will need to develop a lot of new policies, to be honest, different from what the Lifelong Learning Commission the 2019 general election suggested. I think those are really good building blocks. Clearly, more to think about, including, as Liz says, in the area of short vocational courses. Which would be a really useful thing to have a good map of now when you're going through a pandemic and people are going to need to come back into employment very quickly and perhaps take very sudden and sharp changes of employment direction. And the government's offer, Restart, Kickstart, all the rest, seem to be pretty inadequate to the task that we face. Exams at 16, I mean, this has been so interesting. It's really interesting to see that it's Ken Baker who introduced the GCSE, now being the champion of its abolition. And I think there are some really important issues that he raises, exactly as you say, that 16 isn't a school leaving age now, so why would you take a terminal exam? But I do think that there is a point about particularly English and maths, about basic skills at 16, because if you haven't got those skills by that point, all your further study, all your employment opportunities, I think, are just almost irredeemably compromised. So there may be, I'm not setting labour policy, I'm merely sharing some of the thinking in my head at the moment about this, about the questions we need to ask. I see the case for why would you have a national exam sequence at 16 when nobody leaves full-time education at that point. Absolutely see that. But I do think we must address this question of English and maths. I think this is an important subset of the question, and I'm very, very anxious to make sure that we do get that right.
Okay, thank you. This is quite a marathon for you, Kate, and I'm just going to take 3 more questions, which are things that have come through. But before I do that, I just want to say that Anna Smith's question was actually about listening to teachers and the professional organisations in terms of policy making, not just in the sense of the pandemic.
Yeah.
Now, the 3 that really stick out, now obviously private schools, I didn't mention private schools, which for me is very unusual, but I mean, I do like to talk about the state sector primarily, but obviously the private system is a big part of the schools market, and Labour's had some policies over the past few years about private schools, so any thoughts there? The next one is about Erasmus. Would you reinstate Erasmus? And then tuition fees. I think people would like to know whether it is Labour's policy to have no tuition fees or not. And finally, do you think there is scope to flex the national curriculum at all in a local sense, or is the principle of a national curriculum for all the right approach? Okay.
So just going back to why don't I listen to teachers when it comes to policy making? If I may say so, I think that's a bit harsh. For a start, I haven't made any policies yet. And secondly, of course, we're listening to teachers and professional organisations and teaching unions. And in fact, the teaching unions are coming in to meet Keir and me again on Tuesday. We have regular roundtable discussions with them. I'm sorry, but it is just not the case that we don't listen to and meet and hear from and engage with and take on board what the experts at the chalk face are saying to us. Why would we not? As I say, I'm the daughter of 2 teachers. You don't have to persuade me of the expertise, professionalism and commitment of teachers. I want to hear from them. I want to draw on that knowledge and expertise, and they will have every opportunity, and many of them are members of our movement, to contribute to our policy making in the field of education. And if you've got policy ideas you'd like me to be considering, for goodness sake, make sure that we know about them, send them in. And linked to that, Fiona, your question about a national curriculum or should it be flexed locally, I'd be really interested in the profession's views on that question. I got into a bit of trouble a few weeks ago with a lot of head teachers when I said I thought the curriculum was a bit joyless and narrow. If there are people on this call who think that actually what we need is more flexibility and variety and creativity in the curriculum, if you'd like to make common cause with me against some of those head teachers, I'd be very keen to hear from you. I think there are really interesting questions around this. We don't want to compromise on standards. I want to be absolute. Anna's asking you a question again. How will I do it? Well, by listening, meeting, and inviting them to put in submissions, Anna. I'm not quite sure what the difficulty is here, other than engaging with people. I'm not sure how you get their ideas, and that's what we do. And if they've got ideas on local flexing of the curriculum and why that's important, what it could look like, please send them in. As I say, on tuition fees, Keir did make the point in his leadership campaign that he remained committed to the 2019 manifesto promise on tuition fees. And I also have a particular concern, as I said earlier, about maintenance loans, which I think are a real barrier to the participation of the most disadvantaged students in both higher and further education, which we need to address. So I'm very interested in what people feel about this. I'm very interested in what the public feel about it. What is the right funding model? I think we do have to recognise that tuition fees are deterring, and maintenance costs are deterring, particularly mature students, particularly deterring part-time students, that the level of debt now compared with when they were first introduced by Labour is so large that it is actually, I think, is a deterrent to the participation of some students from disadvantaged backgrounds. I think we have to recognise that and look at a funding model that does not act as a barrier to widening participation and access, but that does recognise that there are gains to the individual as well as to society as a whole from having a university education. What is the way in which we find, what is the funding mechanism that we find that recognises and shares those benefits fairly, but absolutely make sure that we widen participation, particularly to those who are likely to find it hardest if there is a fee to be paid. Private schools, they educate 7% of our children. They are not, in terms of the number of priorities, my top priority. Like you, Fiona, I spend most of my time thinking about the 93% of children in the state system as a hope that people would expect. But there is something wrong with a system where 7% of children are enjoying a level of resources, a level of individual attention, a level of facilities, and then a level of access to networks and opportunities that leads them to dominate the best paid, most powerful professions. There's something wrong with the system that allows that to continue. And there are models that we can look at around the world where much greater integration of the private system into the public system has been done. And I think we'd be remiss not to look at what is within the art of the possible when Labour returns to power. And finally, on Erasmus Plus, what a tragedy that we have walked out of that. We wait to see what the new replacement Turing scheme will offer. But one thing it definitely won't offer is reciprocity. It will be a one-way street. We won't be welcoming European Union students to this country under the Turing scheme. And that for us is a huge loss because we're enriched by those students' presence in our universities while they're here. They open minds, they offer new experiences and perspectives, they enrich the learning experience of the home students that they meet. And in the longer run, they give us relationships with our European neighbours that are important for economic, for political, for security, for international relationships and negotiations, prosperity and influence. And we are cutting ourselves off from those relationships, cutting ourselves off from welcoming the young people who will be the leaders of tomorrow's Europe. And I think it is such a foolhardy thing for our government to have done. And if Labour comes back into power, I can't tell you if it will still be Erasmus. It will still be running, of course, in 2024. It's on a 7-year funding scheme in EU funding terms. I can't tell you, what the terms will be, whether we will be able to go back into it or what might come in the funding round that the European Union puts in place after that. But as Keir has said throughout our really horrible experience of going through this Brexit process, we see the deal that was negotiated just before Christmas as a very thin deal, and our purpose when we return to government is to build out on it. And I am absolutely determined that re-embedding an Erasmus-like genuine student exchange scheme will be one of the things that we will do.
Okay, thank you very much. I think I'm going to draw it to a close now, because you may want to make a few final comments. We've covered a lot of ground. And I'm sure everybody here is really looking forward to this policy making process. Not me, because I desperately need something to write about. So I've been writing about Michael Gove and the offshoot of his terrible time as Education Secretary for the past 10 years. And it's getting quite boring now. So we desperately need some new policies. But would you really like to sum up is there anything I haven't asked you? I often ask people that when I'm interviewing them. Is there anything I haven't asked you that you would like to say to the there's quite a lot of people on this call listening and really pleased with everything that they've heard and the quality of your comments. So is there anything you'd like to?
Let me just say that this is Nothing is more important to the labour movement than the future of our children and young people. There isn't a job bigger in its significance for our values and what we stand for as a party than being Labour's Shadow Secretary of State for Education, I hope one day Secretary of State for Education. And we are absolutely determined in the Shadow Education team that children and young people come first for us. Children, young people, learners' futures are what we care about. And we are absolutely animated by Keir's vision of this as the best country to grow up in. We think our education policy has to be driving and delivering towards that goal. And I know there are many, many experts in the labour movement and on this call who can help us to envisage and deliver on that. And I really hope you want to help.
Thank you. And I think, for those who asked, I think this session will be recorded and available later. Andrew will be able to confirm that for you. But anyway, big round of applause for Kate. I know you can't even clap on the screen with this function, but thank you very much. Lovely to see you again. And thank you to everybody for their fantastic questions and for being such an engaged audience. Thank you.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye.